Hello everyone, today we talk about the Thuringians for our holiday special about the peoples of the migration era. For the sake of, simplicity, we'll call them Thuringians. In fact, Thuringii would be proper in the Latin term of it, but we normalize it like that. In fact, the name would be Thuringii, Thuringii, or Teurio Kaimai, right? And we will explain the etymologies of this, or how, simply where we know the name from, what peoples we think that they would correspond even from a geographical point of view. And we talk about them as an early Germanic people, proper, that appeared during, however, the late migration era. In this area between the Harz Mountains in central Germania, a region that in fact is still known today as the Bundesland of Thuringen, right, of Thuringia. And these people became a kingdom, right, which also came into conflict with the Merovingian Franks, famously, with the Saxons in part too. We'll see that the Thuringians seem to have been connected with the northern neighbors, and they would be remembered historiographically, fundamentally, as through this bond. And it's a people that, one of those that, in a sense, didn't make it as an autonomous one. As we will see, their power essentially shrank after the Frankish conquest at the beginning of the 6th century, was achieved, however, also through the Saxon intervention. That's a pretty good example of how, this time actually both Franks or Saxons were, not dramatically different, but surely heading towards different directions, wiped out essentially these people that, however, remained as naturally in an ethnical sense to even with the present day identity in the German region, and that would fundamentally maintain also a specific recognition, and would also rise and try to win its freedom back again in the centuries to come, right? In this properly in the Barbaricum, right, in these areas that had not been Romanized, that would maintain, in fact, a kind of a frontier character. Thuringia, in the ancient sense, was literally resized, because certain parts of it, as we will see, would be settled by the Polabian Slavs. Other areas were conquered by other people. So Thuringia, as the stem lands of the of Eastern Francia, would be smaller, right? In part incorporated eventually by Saxony. So we're talking, last time we talked about the Gepids. Also, the Thuringians are a bit the defeated of the situation, but at least they lived on as with a broader legacy, a defined let's say also area of settlement, and where their culture remained. And that also had been much less, on the move than other people. So here we're talking essentially about tribes that, whatever their ethnogenesis came to be from a political point of view, remained fundamentally more or less in the same areas of Central, Eastern Germania fundamentally, and the origins of which are also debated, because we don't properly know much about them, but their story is definitely very interesting. They, as we have seen, the Merovingian Franks extended their influence on them. Eventually, the Thuringians fell under Frankish control, and as we've seen, the name of Thuringia is still used for one of modern Germany's federal states. So the Thuringians do not appear in classical Roman texts under that name, right? They are people that fundamentally were that appeared in this regard with their ethnonym in a second phase, as most what we define as Germanic peoples in the migration period proper. However, there is an hypothesis, as some scholars have suggested, that the Thuringians might have been the remnants of the Hermanduri or Hermanduri tribe that was part of the Suebic Confederacy, that was fundamentally had its own center in just north of today's Thuringia, more or less geographical point of view. There were lots of peoples among them as well. Think about the Longobards. They were essentially Elb Germans, right? And the reason of this hypothesis is the last part of the comes from a mix, a comparison with the last part of the Hermanduri, that is Turi, hence Turi, right? That could represent at least the same sound, and the Germanic suffix ing, suggesting the meaning of descendants of the Hermandur. More or less, the areas were similar. Not quite, right? It's not that even from classical sources we have the perfect realization of who was who. The Romans made this list of tribes. The geographers, the historiographers, more or less give us a picture of who was who, and we can, through other evidence and hints, draw a political map of Germania at this point. We know that the Hermanduri lived near to the Marcomanni that were settled fundamentally in the Danube, in Bohemia fundamentally, and also expanded further, and that were an important tribe, as you know, was advanced, also substantially Celticized. At the beginning, the Romans actually were quite concerned among the various Germanic peoples at the time of the same conquest of Germania to wipe out the Marcomanni. That would live on, as you know, with the Marcomannic Wars and so on. Tacitus, in his Germania, describes the Hermanduric homeland as being where the Elbe starts, right? So at the springs of the Elbe. But also, these peoples are said to have had colonies on the Danube, and even within the Roman Empire, within the Roman province of Raetia. And this gives you the Raetia or Raetia, if you prefer. This gives you the picture of how, loose certain boundaries could be, how, what we think as like inside or outside the empire is fundamentally a modern concept that didn't quite exist at the time. These were populations the Romans more, extended their influence in, and that whatever the processes had brought them to brought this to happen, spread with different colonies. They mostly had, the Germans, broadly speaking, descended from the far north into this area, Central Europe, that was originally Celtic and kept pushing. In fact, Raetia was fundamentally a Celtic or Celticized land, not a Germanic one, right? South of the Danube was Celtic lands, and yet they expanded, they migrated. The same Marcomannic expanded, for example, in the land of the Boii, right, and absorbing, in fact, also much of their craft, of their wealth. They think about the mines and so on. So Claudius Ptolemy, one of the most important geographers, of course, if not the most, actually, of the ancient world, mentions that neither the Hermanduri nor the Thuringians in his geography, but instead these other people that actually could fit, that are called the Thuringii, right? Also, we think it might have been this was the Latinized form, but in Greek it sounds basically the same. It's also in Latin expressed as Turone, so at least we make a parallel between the two. As if you look at the list of the Germanic peoples and tribes, you can have an idea of that. Who lived in just north of the Sudetes Mountains, right? Thought to be the Erzgebirge. And this may also be connected, in fact, to the later Thuringians as a people. As we've seen, there were branches, right? These peoples moved, expanded. They needed new land because they may have not had enough resources at a local level to make it, so they expanded fundamentally for this reason. And the Kaimai, as a term, may in the word Thuringii, may represent a version of the Germanic word home, right? Like Heimat in German. And Ptolemy also mentions a people called the Bainokaimai to the west of the Elbe. And he also apparently spells the name of the Kamavi in a similar way. So maybe a connection of sort. The formation of this people might have had also been influenced by two longer known tribes that are more associated with the eastern bank of the lower Elbe River, that is essentially northeast of Thuringia, geographically speaking, because later on the Carolingian law code written for them, right? The Franks did like that at some point because these people were mostly illiterate, and once they were conquered, the Carolingians at that point, codified a law for them that they had to obey to was part of the local legal customs, but at the same time, some impositions. Think about the laws imposed on the Saxons and so on. Written for them, this code was called Law of the Angles and Varini, that is the Thuringians. So this connection with the Angli, right? The Saxon peoples, right? The same ones that eventually migrated in part in Britain, it seems to be evidenced by such etymologies. This is fascinating because actually, as we were saying before, and as we will see eventually, the Saxons incorporated important parts of Thuringia, and the Thuringians may have simply, of whatever they were called like at the beginning, might have come from through the same way, right? The same direction, and all these peoples, like, it's not they had a specific separation. I mean, they called themselves like that because of political reasons, but they were all part of this broader northern central populations that formed, in the most various, they were blended and they were homogeneous together. I mean, they also, from a material culture point of view, we have this broader, at some point, especially in migration years, Merovingian, say Frankish, Thuringian, Elbe material culture that was actually shared by great part of Central Europe. I don't know, also the Longobards fit in that. So it doesn't mean much. I have my opinion that there is a debate whether, where did this culture, think about the Rhein-Grabe culture, where did it originate from? It's interesting because Thuringia, it's mostly this culture shifted towards the west, like the Rhine basin, and it kind of the most advanced areas there at the time. My opinion is that it's a broader cultural form that expanded from there, right? Simply because it was, the most resourceful areas. And then also the Thuringians that show that were essentially sharing it and also imitating it further because of all the matters of political connection. We'll see better. They were quite strong with the Franks, as you can imagine, even just if you look at the distance in there. But also specifically because imitation and because, of course, what the Franks were achieving between the 5th and the 6th century as becoming the major power in the region. So much earlier, so it's interesting, however, that in Carolingian times there was this connection, literally, between the Angles, the Varini, and the Thuringians. And much earlier, Tacitus, in his Germania, had grouped these two tribes, the Angles and the Varini, among the more distant Suebic tribes, right, living beyond the Elbe and near a sea where they worshipped Erthus. This naturally reflects the importance of the Suebic confederacy that at the beginning of, say, in Caesar's Augustan time, that was the major power, fundamentally, in this northeastern Germania, or at least, what it would be today's Germany, mostly, because naturally the Germans had already expanded far towards the east at that point, so it would be mostly central northern Germania for those time standards. And Pliny the Elder had listed, interestingly, the Varini as a Vandalic or East Germanic tribe, which is naturally different from the Elbe Germans. At least, some Germanists make this difference, like just between Eastern and Western and Northern Germans. Others actually, I like it in the same, because actually there is some commonality. Speak of the Elbe Germans as well, right? And the Swabians would be that. I say it just because, as you know, I I did my share of things about the Longobards, but also the Alamanni, for example. I mean, we know it, even just linguistically in the few remnants with the evidence we have from how these people spoke, that that there was something in common in there. But what was fascinating about the Thuringians were these etymological connections with these other peoples concrete, as far as the ancient geographers and historiographers said, that this was not just an Elb people, but it actually shared something possibly and surely actually with the northern Germans, like with the Jutland Peninsula, and naturally all the Germans came from the north, at least as far as I understand it, surely mixed with the pre-existing populations, but the point is the Thuringians may have been way more connected to let's say to that specific channel of and connection specifically with peoples like the Angli, for example, and even with the East Germans, right? So an important composition. This is interesting because if you look at the Thuringians themselves differently from other Germanic peoples that we commented, and maybe we should update also a bit the older videos we made about, I don't know, the Burgundians, the Vandals, because those were interesting ones, but it's when my videos sucked, more than they do today. You notice that they were not like one of these strong people on the move. They were mostly a polity that surely had its own ethnic identity. They were not like, I don't know, like the Bavarians, that were kind of a fictitious creation under Merovingian mediation, but they probably had their own thing. There is also a specific territoriality of their in their polity, that territorial rooting in their polity, but they're not part of the big ones, right? They're not part of in this year. I decided to look at this, if you want, smaller entities, but they were more sedentary. Those are the peoples who remain in Germany. Most of them, as you know, went touring the world and conquering big kingdoms in the south, in the rich lands and so on. These guys remained there, and they had, however, as we'll see better now, an important connection also with the rest of the world. From the German heartland, they were involved in international policy, and they had an interesting and specific role. And also, some of their members were definitely very important. They had important connections with some of the greatest rulers of the time. Speaking still of the Angles and the Varni, these two tribes are among Germanic groups known to have been found north of the Danube in this period. So that direction altogether in connection with the Thuringians seems to be probable. Procopius, in his Gothic Wars, describes the land of the Varini as being south of the Danes, right? But north of the Slavs. This is interesting because at this point the Slavs were in turn north of the uncultivated lands which lay north of the Danube, because the Slavs were fundamentally wedging towards the Danube, like other peoples. I mean, Procopius' times, we know, I don't know, the Longobards that were basically the people, the Germanic people were most, on that frontier, were descending south, so the Slavs gradually occupying Moravia, those lands. This is important because, as we were saying before, the Slavs would in part settle into the Thuringian territory as well. All right, that here we're talking about western eastern bank of the Elbe. As you know, in early medieval times, that's actually the band in previous times was all, Germanic or Germanized. In later times, on the right bank of the Elbe, you have the Slavs, and the west, you have the Germanic peoples. So this information is from Procopius seems to be spot on for what we know, because technically, even if you look in these maps I placed, there is the Jutland Peninsula, the Danes, and then go south, there is the Thuringians, and east and southeast, you start having a consistent Slavic presence. So the name of the Thuringians appears to be first mentioned in the veterinary treatise of Vegetius, written in the early 5th century. So also, this is kind of random, but it tells you how it's not that we have dramatic information about these people together at this time. There were the Goths, the Franks, the Alemanni, were all pretty well known. These people appears in a less resounding way, which probably reflects not just the fact that they were properly in the heart of Germany and so more distant from the limes, but specifically, relatively, by the way, but that they probably had a less impact than other populations. The Thuringians appear, interestingly, in some lists of the peoples involved in Attila's invasion of Gaul. Right? This is of dramatic importance because of we made important videos. I would say some of the finest in Schwerpunkt. Some videos turn out well. Most do not, from my perspective. Those videos are interesting because we have traced, if you remember, if you're a regular follower, we have traced this broader international situation that eventually the Germans are a bit protagonists of between the Huns and the Romans. Like, they had to choose to be either from one side or another. Maybe they wouldn't choose them because, of course, if they had been for them, nobody likes to be dominated. But the question is, you have to make a choice, and even if you can't, you stay within that dimension. You have to adapt in a certain way. The Thuringians in the future would represent, in a sense, one of the hardest stocks of that non-Catholic and non-Roman, let's say, faction that was shared by other peoples, namely, especially the Franks, and it's not a surprise here that Thuringians also would choose that side. And embodying, let's say, if we can't even talk about Germanistic, something like that, kind of a Germanistic, it's a bit forced as a term, but, you understand, in pagan or Aryan bloc, right, that would go fundamentally against the hegemonic role that was being created by the 6th century by the Franks in Constantinople, right, and the axis of this being mostly, maintained by the Gothic power altogether, mostly Austro-Gothic Italy, especially under the time of Theodoric, the Visigoths, that were Aryans, and other populations of Central Europe that were siding with, for example, with the Thuringians at this point in an anti-Frankish function, such as the Longobards, right? So this idea that some Germans had fundamentally accepted the idea of Romanization, of mixing with the Roman or Romanized elites to convert to Catholicism, and or to make a policy of integration fundamentally, and other Germanic peoples that it's not because they had a more or less offensive capability, or simply they feared actually to be incorporated into that Roman, at this point, Roman Germanic Empire. Think about Merovingians, what they were creating. We'll talk more of that later. But so this axis was quite important because it encompassed, paradoxically, from some extremes of Europe. Pick Ostrogothic Italy that we have discussed many times, is by far at that point before the Gothic War the most Romanized land, right? And still also with the most among at least some of the most Romanized Germanic peoples are the Ostrogoths at this point, and the extreme of Germany, right, of the north, of these areas that had not been Romanized, had not been Christianized, not very superficially, and that, however, feared, in fact, the expansion of a new empire, the one of Constantinople and the Franks combined, and all the interests that you can imagine. And this axis is very well drawn, politically speaking. And eventually, it came to an end, especially with the Gothic War, where the Byzantines reconquer Italy, and also the Franks basically come to get interested in Italy as well. The situation would be frozen for a couple of centuries because the Longobards enter in Italy and they as a wedge, and they basically maintain not much that axis, because that axis didn't quite exist anymore. So there's broader demographic, economical contraction of the whole Eurasia and so on. So these powers, look at the Merovingians or look even at the Roman Empire, they contract. So there's not much that kind of internationalism, if not in a more, in more fluid sense. These peoples recognized international. The 6th century is where these peoples start to properly identify themselves as Germanic alongside the Roman historiographical pattern, and to found on that specific identity also the international prestige of their rule in an anti-Roman sense. So all these populations eventually came to, as we'll see, matrimonial policy since an early age were pretty advanced. It was mostly an elite thing, as you imagine, and the Thuringians in Germany are like their closest neighbors are part of that stock of peoples that fundamentally are not dramatically developed, they're not dramatically stratified, so the freeman class has more importance, and they do not like much the context, the concept of the elite or domination. Next door they have the Franks that have taken a leap forward exactly into that direction, including the one of Christianization, so it's very complex and interesting in this sense. Also, the connections between Alemannia and Thuringia are very fascinating, because it seems that they were closely connected. Also, the Ermenduris seem to have spanned originally across a bit the two areas, so these peoples probably had something in common as a bit of the frontier of the Merovingian world, and this bit of a kind of an ambiguous, fluid, decentralized reality. The Thuringians, as we'll see in the 7th century, will rebel against the Franks, allying themselves with the kingdom of Samo. Right, that incidentally was also a Frankish merchant, apparently, but dominating an important Slavic area across the Danube, and it's very complex. The important thing to realize here, of course, is that Thuringians are a modest power, right? They create a kingdom, as we'll see now, but they do not manage to take it further, right? They do not have a dramatic demographic and therefore military potential for migration era standards. They stay entrenched in their important lands covered in forests, mountains. They definitely know the advantages deriving from that as well. But the fact that the Thuringians went under Attila is quite meaningful, because Attila, in a sense, was pursuing that anti-Roman ideal, right? That sense that the Germans altogether could be co-opted by these Asian rulers. Definitely accelerating the process of creation of elites that was happening, however, in Thuringia as well, as, in the broader migration era. If you pick the Germans at the time of Augustus, they were, dramatically, unstratified. They were more primitive. They had less. At this point, Germany is also has started developing. Cattle is becoming more important, international trade more important, crafts more important. These peoples are importantly Romanized, more or less, at least as far as that development was concerned. The Hunnic experience was surely traumatizing, possibly for these peoples in mostly today's Germany, not as much as it would be for Eastern Europe. It was literally overwhelmed, and also the Pannonian Plain, where the Huns settled in their center. So they were a bit more defilated, like the Thuringians, the Longobards, the Heralds, the Rugi. They maintained more, they were more detached, but they still were involved into the system. And that system was, by definition, in terms of side, it was, as we were saying before, either you're from the Roman side or from the Hunnic side. These guys were from the Hunnic side, so they also developed this idea that, despite they surely didn't share much with the Huns, that they could be the next ones, right? Their model of leadership was much more influenced by the steppes model than from the Roman one. So it was inherently a more warlike and, aggressivistic and mindset that naturally created problems towards Rome. Also because, of course, those peoples that were from the Hunnic side were incidentally the least Romanized already, because they were from the other side of, the Roman boundaries, and less Christianized, and therefore that model of that warlike idea, especially when the Huns eventually declined and left these peoples to essentially free themselves, had boosted their offensive capacity naturally was projected as the last peoples, if you want, of the migration here, at least in Western Europe, to oppose to, as we've seen before, especially the Catholic powers, the Merovingians and in Constantinople, right? So Walter Paul has proposed that the Thuringians may be the same as these other people, the Turcilingi or Torcolingi, or you could say Turcilingi or Torcolingi or whatever, but who were one of the tribes near the Middle Danube, right? So slightly southeast compared to Thuringia proper, after the collapse of the empire of Attila, to whom they had apparently all been subject, right? This is fascinating. So the Thuringians would have participated to Attila's invasion of Gaul. Hence, even if there's no clear evidence of that, surely to events like, I don't know, the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, surely, as we've seen also with the example of the Turcolingi, there were other chunks of peoples, of the same people scattered somewhere. The Middle Danube at that point fit a bit in between. I mean, Hunnic times more from the Hunnic side, but so they kind of fit. But it was, however, a footstep of the Thuringians, perhaps in a southern dimension. So some of their youth, some of their war bands, whatever, would participate to this broader, as we've seen before, offensive towards their own world, and also at the end of the day, however, understanding, especially as Germans, differently from the Huns, they were very different. The advantages of Roman civilization, we wanted to share it, not to destroy it, but still maintaining this sense that it had to be something else, right? This is very important. Most of these peoples wouldn't make it. Here I should open a huge digression of what it means to be part of Rome by the 6th century. Let's say, in the sense that if you look at the Franks, the Goths, etc., they were all the Franks, the Goths. They never renounced their Germanic identity, but at the same time, they were building their leadership on clearly Roman Catholic and imperialistic models that are to be found basically in every. I mean, look from coinage, titles, ecclesiastical policy. Okay, there were other peoples that perhaps the only clear surviving example of is the Longobards. They instead entered at that point actually in the single most Romanized land of the empire, that is Italy itself, and do not ever, even in the following centuries, ever trade. Despite getting Romanized for obvious in the practicality of it, but from an institutional, juridical point of view, they remain always Germans. They do never start claiming to be like, to make this imperialistic, hegemonistic policies. They remain the Longobards, right? And they actually Germanize the land. And even though they convert to Catholicism, that is also important. We'll talk about Agilulf, king of the Longobards, was actually a Thuringian, and he was crucial for the passage from Arianism to Catholicism, incidentally, at that point, also thanks to the Bavarian medium of Theodolinda. Bavarians and Thuringians were, in this sense, neighbors, and framed within this broader Merovingian sphere of influence. So they shared definitely something about their role there. So you understand how many implications, subtle ones, because these are ones that basically came up, I can say recently, but through the observation of relations that can be hardly equivocated, right? So, important Hunnic experience for the Thuringians, right? And after that, the Thuringians fear the Franks, that are after Attila's demise. We're talking about as you know, the mid 5th century, and therefore also the gradual also shrinking of the Western Roman Empire. The Franks expand, they defeat other peoples, etc. Think about the Alemanni. The Thuringians realized the Alemanni happened in 481, if I'm not wrong. The Thuringians that are already in important relations with the Franks, as far as this inherent tension of whether they would be subjugated or not, fear. So what they do, that axis we were talking about before, they associate themselves with Odoacer, right, who later became king of Italy, that already at this time was, as you know, had this origin that could actually been associated. Even if think about the Syri, right? You know, this Odoacer was not the head of a Germanic people in Italy, but as you know, at the head of the remnants of all these war bands of federati that had made up the army of Italy in the last decades, right? And so Odoacer is another of the greatest, some of the great defeated in history. So it's not that he managed to accomplish a great much. Eventually, he would be overrun and killed by Theodoric, by the Ostrogoths. But the connection with Italy at that point and Thuringians would remain. It happens under Odoacer, under the Goths, and under the Longobards as well, as we will see. Other tribes in the region at the time included the Thuringii. We're talking about the Middle Danube, right, and the Herulds, right, that all had interesting connection in this regard. The connections here between the Thuringians and the Longobards are especially fascinating, because basically, but at some point, bordered each other, even if we are not between Bohemia and Moravia and the Thuringia. You know, the Thuringii are also connected with the Longobards, and with this coming from Scandinavia, with the first arrival in Rugiland, in Rugen. Fundamentally, the Herulds are also defeated by the Longobards at a point, and we find this Thuringii on the same part, and it might have been connected with the Thuringians. Sidonius Apollinaris, as you know, a Romano-Visigothic author, in one of his poems explicitly lists the Thuringians among the allies who fought under Attila when he entered in Gaul in 451. During the reign of Childeric I in Francia, Gregory of Tours and Fredegar record an interesting history that basically the Frankish king Childeric I married the runaway wife of the king of the Thuringians. The story goes like this. So Basinus is the first recorded Thuringian king. Whatever it meant, it's not like the Thuringia was an actual unitary kingdom of sort. It was just one of the kings, or the most prominent, the first recorded, at least historically, and he was married to this Basina or Basine. And the idea is that she basically abandoned his husband, king, right? Why? Because allegedly, I mean, here the history can be a bit distorted, because, I mean, not Gregory of Tours, Fredegar in this can be, you know, we don't think it's an historical thing, but there are certain meanings here that are fascinating, because according to them, she, according to Gregory of Tours specifically, Basina herself said, quote, "I want to have the most powerful man in the world, even if I have to cross the ocean for him." Right? This is a dramatically fascinating statement for a number of reasons. Now, first of all, what we haven't said here, but that we addressed in other videos, is very important, is that Childeric I and Basina are no one else but the parents of Clovis. So these are dramatically important figures, because they represent two different worlds that find a meeting point, of course, in this story. Childeric I, we know him. In his time, he was a Roman federatus. He fought for the Romans a big deal under Aegidius. He was exiled actually at a point in Thuringia, not surprisingly, because of course, you know, the Franks were ambiguous. At this point, they weren't properly a unitary set. That they, you know, Childeric emerged as one of the most powerful, and also because of his expansion in Roman Gaul. But this expansion in Roman Gaul was naturally a choice in terms of, you know, integration with the Romano-Catholic elites, even if at this point it's very debated how much the Franks were not particularly Romanized nor Christianized, aside from what is usually believed at this point yet. It's Clovis that takes the big step, makes the Franks passing from paganism straight to Catholicism without passing through Arianism, albeit we think all these people might have been more or less Arian, so formally Christian, including Basina actually, or even if it's debatable, of course, is in the same Childeric. Childeric was found in his grave with a Roman seal, right, presenting himself not just as a Germanic chieftain, but properly as a Roman foederatus, and a Roman soldier in a sense, and that represents the political ambition of opening to Gaul and this cradle of Romanity. That would be the same formula that Clovis basically used to rise to power in Gaul, and in a certain sense betraying the same Frankish people that instead didn't like at all, like, in the Germanic traditional sense, any kind of kingship, right? Clovis literally beheads all the other Frankish chieftains, imposes his authority with iron fist on his own people, and he builds this private dynasty that will remain as a broader legacy in European history through the Romano-Catholic medium of the dramatically important Gallo-Roman clergy that ruled Gaul as landlords and would, mix fundamentally with the Frankish nobility and gave rise to eventually the war. The Frankish war we know more clearly as, in fact, something very different from the original people. Basina comes from Thuringia, and she therefore is probably the product of some, as we were saying before, some of the hardest pagan and Germanic stocks, right? Independently from what the international fiction of their Arianism actually was. Many Germanic peoples were Arians because they had to look, at least formally Christian in front of the Romans to naturally accomplish a big deal from an international point of view with them. But first of all, from a pagan mindset, like Christianity is just one of the other, Christ is just one of the other deities, so it's not a big deal to even become Christian. They could be pagan and Christian at the same time. The concept that's an exclusivistic idea is a monotheistic principle. But of course they would be de facto pagan. Thuringia, let's be honest, right? We know that the Alemanni were pagans for lots of years. So you can imagine even further north and east what it was like. And this is dramatically important because if you realize it in a Freudian sense, from a psychoanalytical sense, what Clovis' mind was about, you have your father that is basically the champion of that pro-Roman and pro-Catholic policy, and your mother that, especially for a male son, is a big deal, is the champion or representative, at least in that sense, of a pagan and properly Germanic. I can't say anti-Roman, but I use the term Germanistic for not using this too, that not render the idea side, right? So this is a heavy legacy. It's something that Clovis, in all his ruthless and brutal policy, Clovis has a huge importance. We can't compare him to Constantine, right, the Great. As far as the Western side of mostly the legacy of it, lived on, was a dramatically intelligent person. What Clovis accomplished in his life, we made lots of videos about him, is astonishing, right? For the history of Western Europe, the Western world, it changed everything, right? There was no deterministic reason for which the Franks at a certain point should have been recompacted under a single rule to create a dynastic power that would rule most of Western Europe and have this dramatic legacy eventually with the Carolingians, with the with all that what brought for the Renovatio Imperii in the West. It's everything, right? The Catholic connection, it changed the world forever, right? And therefore, you may wonder what brought, first of all, an author like Gregory of Tours that naturally was writing in an edifying sense, especially Clovis' figure, right, to make his mother say, I want to have the most powerful man in the world, referring to Childeric I, even if I have to cross the ocean for him. Here the ocean has nothing to do because there's not an ocean between Thuringia and Francia, actually even border, but I presume it's always this connection, this mythology of the Merovingian dynasty that had to do with maritime monsters, this ancient sacred connection with the Franks, with water, that is to be found actually in other Germanic myths of an ethnogenesis that has to do, of course, with the northern origin, the crossing of the Baltic or the North Sea or whatever, but also, I presume also, I like to see it with the Frankish involvement in piracy throughout the 3rd, 4th century. That was intense, telling the truth, everywhere, in Mediterranean, in the North Sea and so on. And the question here is, she embodies evidently, and this was known by Gregory, this Germanic mindset for which objectively that was ferocious, like at the limit, it's a moral standard that we also have difficulty to admit, but that instinctively makes sense. I mean, this woman wants to be married to the strongest man out there. These were peoples that objectively didn't have much of any moral standard, but the idea that the stronger had to rule on the conquered, right? There was no other way to see it. Childeric was accomplishing a great deal, right? Mostly also thanks to this important Romano-Gallic connections, and had extended his power importantly, not enormously, right? So this also tells you in perspective, by scale, what were the Thuringian standards compared to other peoples. I mean, at this time, you have think about the Visigoths or the Vandals, eventually the Goths, that accomplish actually a much bigger deal than what had been accomplished by Childeric. Then Clovis would have accomplished the greatest much. So actually, I think Basina she would have been very proud to know that her son would accomplish the thing that he would, in the sense of defeating a hell of a lot of people, extending this enormous dominion on most of the Atlantic plains of Europe, and having a major game changer in the continent. And we don't know, however, how happy she would have been to know that her son, would have actually done that by becoming not just Christian but Catholic, and to basically make a deal in a dynastic that is anti-democratic, surely not in the modern, comparably to the modern term, but in terms of freemanship of the time system in Gaul, right? But she would have been held proud, also because in the same Clovis, however, the two things coexist. I mean, here we're talking about properly Romano-Germanic rulers, so they're a bit of both things. And surely if we look at peoples like the Franks, yes, they were much more Germanized, we think, right? The myth that the Franks were Romanized, it's a bit of a hard to die thing. The Goths were generally Romanized. I mean, in there we see what the limits of that was. But here, that's the point. We're talking about the boundaries of Germany, right? And you can imagine what this world could be by the 5th, by 6th century, right? The Rhine Valley, in spite of its development, its important urbanization, romanization, had gone quickly depopulated. The Romans had settled the Franks there essentially because there wasn't much else to, it would depopulate it. Those weren't even very productive lands aside from, the trade, the strategic, think about all the strongholds on the river and so on. But and the various rivers that existed in here that were important divides also among the various chunks of the Franks and the Saint Thuringians, right? So this story is definitely fascinating because it shows how a Thuringian queen, technically, not even a princess, even if here probably the story is fictional, because the fact that she would have had abandoned her husband, I don't know how historical that this can be. I mean, given it's not that these women didn't have an actual power, but it sounds a bit flattering considering also the source. I mean, towards the Franks, considering the source where the story comes from. Probably things went differently, but it still reveals the important connection between Thuringia and Francia, and the broader implication of what the Thuringians thought they could share, in a sense, by, the Thuringian elite could share in a sense with the Frankish one still at that point, right? And naturally, this was also, as we were saying before, under the threat of conquest, as in a generation that the thing would actually occur, right? Basina's grandsons would annex Thuringia, right? So that is the meaning of it. Naturally, we have to imagine the complexity of these factions. I mean, the idea that think about what we were saying before about being from the Roman and the Hunnic side, right? If you look at the Battle of the Carolingian Plains, we say, from one side were the Ostrogoths, the Gepids, from the other side the Visigoths, the Franks, because, those are, respectively the Hunnic and the pro-Huns and the pro-Romans, right? Yes, but you could find actually war bands of all these peoples from both sides. At the Carolingian Plains, of course, there were Franks from the Hunnic side. Of course, there were Thuringians that fought under Rome at that point as well, right? So, let's say that the elites tendentially preferred, will towards Romanization, or at least towards that power that could make them autonomous and more prosper. That, given what the Roman lands were in comparison to the Barbaricum, was pretty obvious. But then there would be also a faction that was worried by those same powerful elites to come back, to expand in those other lands as well, and therefore they prefer to act like in the more German and Aryan sense, politically speaking. So this is what, broadly speaking, the Thuringians were, but we imagine naturally also the important connections that, some Thuringians would have been definitely pro-Roman and pro-Catholic, I say in time. It's just probably they were the minority, and the Thuringians altogether fought, in fact, against that bloc most of the time. More clearly, correspondence is recorded with the kingdom of Thuringians by Procopius and Cassiodorus during the reigns of Theodoric the Great. So we're talking about 454 and 526, which also brings to the conquest of Italy in 493, and Clovis the First, I believe approximate 466, 511, right? So this double thread is fascinating, right? It's very fascinating, given that the Goths and the Franks were hostile in that sense. And this naturally all happened after, as you know, chronologically here, after the downfall of Attila and Odoacer, right? So in a situation where that axis was much clearer than before, right? And consider when the Alemanni were wiped, they were next door to the Thuringians, were wiped out by the Franks. It's Theodoric that allows the remnants to settle in the Swiss Alps. Basically, were under Ostrogothic control from Italy, and therefore the Thuringians were freaking out in turn, right? And still, however, maintaining some kind of decent relationship with the Frank, to avoid possible attritions. The Thuringians had some. What is this kingdom of the Thuringians? Well, it's not clear, but what it seems is that during the late 5th century, there was a Thuringian attempt to establish, to expand, let's say. Some talk even of sort of an empire. The idea that the Thuringians began to extend their control on other tribes around. As we know, they didn't much move, but this kingdom reached its territorial peak in the first half of the 6th century, before it was conquered by the Merovingian Franks in 531-532. Examination of Thuringian grave sites reveal cranial features which suggest the strong presence of Hunnic women or slaves, perhaps indicating that many Thuringians took Hunnic wives or Hunnic slaves following the collapse of the Hunnic Empire. Last week we were talking about the Gepids that were the leaders of this coalition of peoples of various, mostly Germanic, but also various ethnicities that had in Central Europe being under Hunnic domination. The Battle of Nedao freed most of these peoples from the Hunnic yoke. And the Thuringians perhaps participated to this, taking this Hunnic wives slash slaves for themselves, which show the that this also it might have been also broader Hunnic influence from previous times, but definitely they didn't kid in terms of enslavement and this kind of trade traffics either. There is, interestingly, in Thuringian grave sites evidence from jewelry found in graves that the people sought marriages with Ostrogothic and Longobard women, right? Which is not strange at all, considering the broader sphere of influence of the Goths at that time, the proximity of the Longobards. And by the way, I didn't say one of the most important things in this regard. And when Basinus, the first Thuringian king, was abandoned by Basina, according to the story, he actually married a Longobard princess that became, in fact, the mother of the following Thuringian king, Ermanfrid. So that is also fascinating because it shows that there was at least some attrition, contracts, marriage, mishandling, at diplomatic international level. Between the Thuringians and the Franks, and that therefore the Thuringians said, okay, they probably had lost something in favor of the Franks. They marry into the Longobard nobility, the Longobard elite, that at that time was instead kind of, I can't say diametrically opposed to the Franks, because it wasn't the thing yet. Actually, the Longobards at some point even become allies of the Romans, just like the Franks, but they're a completely different mindset. They're dramatically much more, less stratified. They're more aggressive. They don't even actually give a damn about the Romans. They just seek this relative support that, as we've seen also in the video about the Geopid Wars, they probably didn't get. It was mostly Longobards sending help to the Romans and the other way around, and finding their own, opening their own way into the Danubian plain, and albeit being also in their important connection, also as we said before, in material culture with this broader Frankish, Thuringian, Alp area, as the Longobards were Germans of the Alp, were, however, dramatically Germanic and Aryan in mindset, right? So at that point, imagine this princess has fled to an important champion of the pro-Roman Germanic policy in Europe. What you do is you seek another wife among those guys that are probably those that care, among those that care the least about that Roman bond, right? And that actually are also your neighbors, and surely not happy if the Thuringia also gets annexed by the Franks, right? So these are important connections that we can't just speculate about, but it sounds kind of obvious, right? Given especially the constant threat under which these peoples were to be wiped out, as at least politically speaking. More of that later, because sometimes people say that Thuringians, and I believe that I made this mistake too in my early years. I believe the Thuringians were kind of wiped out, even in a sort of genocidal sense, right? And this is not true, right? Yes, the Franks and the Saxons probably butchered the hell of them, but it's not that they wiped them out as a people. Their identity remained, their elites remained, and there is no evidence of that kind of brutality. Also because these other entities were not so strong even to wipe a people out, nor they had the interest of it, because otherwise what do you conquer? A people that cannot send you tributes, that cannot work land for you? I mean, it doesn't make sense. And it was always an agreement and negotiation. The connection with the Longobards here is reinforced by the fact that under the leadership of Albin, a large group of Thuringians joined the Longobards on their migration into Italy. And in fact, the Thuringians were a consistent part of those peoples that migrated together with the Longobards in the Italian peninsula. Among them there were even the Saxons, that, as we were saying before, had also this important connection with the Thuringians and with the Longobards too. The lands where the Longobards had been settled are in today's Saxony, actually, because when the Longobards left, the Saxons moved in, and there is actually a place called Bardengau that where probably some Longobards remained, right? Because it's not that they moved all together in block. I mean, some chunks, as we've seen, remained before. And the Saxons expanded also in Thuringia. So it's interesting because the Saxons migrated in Italy too, allegedly with 20,000. But when the Longobards settled, they basically, they were imposed by the Longobards to become Longobards themselves from an juridical point of view. So they didn't accept it, and they came back to Germany, right? Well, the Thuringians instead remained, and probably became Longobards so much that the Longobard king Agilulf, 590-616, was of Thuringian descent. Agilulf was Duke of Turin. The Thuringians had settled in that area of Piedmont. Famously, he was chosen as husband, first of all, and then but by the Authori's widow, Theodolinda. Authori was the first Longobard king after the interregnum, let's say, the so-called ducal anarchy, and he was the one that actually established the Longobard kingdom as properly a central public authority that was never contested after that, and that made a help to also wiping out those Longobards who were signing with the Byzantines in the same Italy and creating this important power. Theodolinda Authori was an Arian, right? Theodolinda was a Bavarian princess. Remember here this broader connection: Bavarians, Thuringians, Longobards, and so on. Who, as a Bavarian, and therefore being daughter of the Bavarian king, was Catholic, because it was the Duchy of Bavaria. The Bavarians weren't even a kingdom, right? They were sort of this Merovingian creation when the Merovingians were, in fact, already Catholic. So she was Catholic, and she had this dramatic importance in the Longobard conversion to Catholicism. And Longobards gave a great importance to women, as in the their wisdom, their choosing capabilities, according to the Germanic tradition, and therefore when Authori died, probably poisoned, the Longobard people, according to the Germanic Assembly, decided to make the queen Theodolinda choose her new husband that would be was Agilulf. It was elected eventually as Longobard king by the Assembly of Armed Men. Agilulf was even a good king, right? And he was very important because he allowed Saint Columba to found famously the monastery of Bobbio in the Po Valley. He was one of the first who actually opened to the Catholic clergy in the kingdom. Theodolinda exchanged correspondence with Gregory the Great, right, with the Pope. Agilulf actually put Rome under siege at the point, enslaved the Roman countries. I mean, these were hard times, but there was a broader appeasement during their reign, and there were great openings, and eventually the Longobards, would become fully Catholic in a relatively few time. There weren't even persecutions properly against the Catholics in the kingdom and so on. But all this medium is fascinating, right? That Agilulf had a Thuringian legacy, a Thuringian ancestry, and that he even came to be actually a king of the Longobards. In that sense, establishing this important connection. Consider that these peoples, even though they had migrated in the south, they still had connections with the north, right? So, from the history, we know that he was a Thuringian by blood. So the former kingdom of the Thuringians arose during the migration period, as we have seen after the decline of the Hunnic Empire in Central Europe in the mid-5th century, and culminating in their defeat in the 454 Battle of Nedao. As we've seen, the first Thuringian king to be documented about 500 AD is this Bizinus, who ruled over actually extended estates that stretched, territorially speaking, beyond the Main River in the south. It was a fairly extended land. His son and successor Manfred who, as we've seen, was also son of a Longobard princess, married Amalaberga, that instead was a niece of the Ostrogoth king Theodoric the Great. Right, the Ostrogoths made this great marriage policy. Theodoric married all his daughters and nieces more or less to the great, to the big of Europe. So here we see reinforced under Manfred the Ostrogothic connection, and this was done to hedge the threat of incursions by the Merovingian Franks in the west, as we were saying before. However, when the Ostrogothic Aryan axis, let's call it whatever we like, collapsed, when King Theodoric died in 526, and this opened problems to his successions, and there was a broader contraction of its power, the Franks took the chance to invade the Thuringian lands, which tells you how fearful they actually were also of possible Ostrogothic intervention. That was, Theodoric was a master minder about this broader international balance, but also the foundations of its power were more unstable than one of the Franks. Right, he fundamentally had his people in an important, rich, and developed area like Italy, but this was the Roman senators ruling the civil administration. Italy didn't have the. Gaul was richer than Italy. Gaul also had this greater, more compact, fertile plains, which was easier to maintain control, and stable. Also logistically, strategically speaking, base for further expansion. Theodoric was threatened also by the proximity of Constantinople by sea with Italy. It had, yes, brought the Visigoths in a kind of client state status, but eventually, it's just because of the minor age of Visigothic king that he adopted. But the compactness of this all wasn't to last after his death. So, but it's important that as soon as he dies, the Franks launched this offensive against the Thuringians and actually defeat them, right, relatively quickly in 531 at the Battle of the Unstrut River. Big battle. These are also, we don't know what actually happened as far as, especially, the troops involved and all, but we know that basically there the Franks carry out this important victory over a people that probably didn't have the same level of military development that the Franks at that point had achieved, right? So here the Franks were inheriting most of, especially at this point, most of the Roman military administration in Gaul was still standing. They had impressive, as we've seen, resources, supplies. The Thuringians might have been more difficult to conquer given the wild environment they lived in, but in terms of political, military capacity, they couldn't be compared, of course. King Theodoric of Rhem and Ermanfrid were trapped in Zülpich, that is, at the time was called Stolbiacum, when the last Thuringian king was killed, right? And his niece, Princess Radegund, was kidnapped by the Merovingian king Clothar I and died in exile in 586. So at this point, the Thuringian realm was shattered. The territory north of the Harz mountain range was settled by Saxon tribes that had participated to the Frankish invasion, or at least, from their side had taken the advantage of the Thuringian weakness to expand in their lands, while the Franks moved into the southern parts of the Main River. Right, the Main River, as you know, is a very important one, and it flows into the Rhine, and it crosses through Germany, and therefore it brings it from east to west, and it brings some important goods from all these areas, and it was an important route over which to expand. And if you look, in fact, at the Merovingian, the easternmost expansion, it follows fundamentally the Main River, because that's where most important wealth would come through, with the tolls, of the river crossings and the river transits, traffics and so on, and the estates east of the Saale River were instead beyond Frankish control, and that's when they are taken over by the Polabian Slavs, right? So also the Slavs take advantage of the Thuringian defeat, and actually they grab a pretty large chunk of land in the east. So, as you understand, this was a brutal subjugation, right? It's not that there was much. The ratio of strength was objectively unfair for them. And after their conquest, the Thuringians were placed under Frankish duches, that is, these dukes, these military commanders, which is something that the Franks usually did. But it's fascinating because usually the Franks were mostly about the comites, this kind of more also can say civilian figures, but at least they were a bit more appeasing than they usually. In fact, they sent literally their military, their hard, their big guns there, is that they probably wanted to rule with iron fist. In fact, the Thuringians rebelled and had at some point regained their independence by the late 7th century, which is actually late in time, under Radulf, who we'll see in a while. And towards the end of the 7th century, also further parts of Thuringia came under Saxon rule. So this might, this gives a picture of instability, generally speaking. I mean, this country, this kingdom has been conquered. So whatever the stability existed before doesn't exist anymore. That is very important. I mean, political unit and cohesion brings to, deterrence, authority, capacity of control. When you have this state of, conquest, so war, destruction, and the fabric is damaged and so on. But there is a further rebellion because this is, at the end of the day, the eastern frontier, some of the least productive lands of the Frankish Empire. And there are these rebels, these chieftains that are able to rise again. Of course, it's like a mess, right? It's like, it's no man's land in a sense that there is no authority of sorts. So the Saxons that are instead compact, cohesive, of course, take advantage for expanding further in the land. The first documented duke of remaining Thuringia was this local noble named Radulf, installed by the same Merovingian king Dagobert in the early 30s of the 7th century. So, of course, the Franks had, just like in other lands, see Alemannia, sent a nobility that would automatically mix with the local one, right? Because Merovingian power at this point was actually contracting, so these comites or duchess were autonomizing themselves, locally speaking, so much that it's only in Carolingian time that the Franks will be able to reestablish their own authority over these realities, and that were technically Frankish, Frankicized, but still they needed sometimes to behead the entire nobility at some point to regain that control. Think about the Alemanni that were, all the noblemen were invited in Francia and, literally slaughtered. So Thuringia was one of these wild lands. Radulf was able to, and of course there would be lots of local nobles that were appointed by Frankish kings because, I don't know, they would promise their support against their fratricide, during their fratricide wars that, plagued the Merovingian kingdom. It basically didn't exist anymore. I mean, they were just 4 separate chunks. And this would give fuel for these guys to autonomize in the outskirts of the empire. And Radulf was able to secure the Frankish border, so he was also cooperating along the Saale River in the east from Slavic incursions. This is quite important. The Slavs were, as you know, were much less stable than polities. I mean, part of them were not even completely sedentarized, but mostly they were also more warlike. They had less resources. But at the same time, were struggling with their elites, some powers that would seek to raid into this richer lands. This was the same with the Saxons, right? These were Frankish lands, so these guys were fighting against the Slavs. But for example, what we've seen it in the video on the Carolingian conquest of Saxony, when Charlemagne invaded Saxony, of course he allied himself with the Slavs from the other side of the Elbe to crush the Saxons together. And when he conquered Saxony, eventually the Franks started fighting against the Slavs. And this German-Slavic frontier here is pretty hot, right? It's and it would remain for most of could say most of the Middle Ages even, but specifically talking about the Elbe or the Saale. These were lands that before the Germans managed to expand further, took a while because the Slavs were objectively were hard to hit. They didn't have a specific center that you could target, and they would come out from somewhere, and they were pretty damn hard sometimes, even just to could raid a really use Iron Fist, it would come back because there was no way to absorb them in a sense. It was like the Romans with the Germans at some point, right? The Westerners had always the kind of the hardest capacity, but these peoples living across the frontier would come back continuously, and they were more warlike, or they had their own point, and they were not so sensitive to the inclusion in that system that also passed, as you understand, through violence and subjugation. So speaking of Radulf, he's grown now under Frankish rule. He knows how the system works. According to the Chronicle of Fredegar in 641-42, his success, his victories, turned his head. That is, made him proud, and he allied with Samo. Right, he had this important kingdom in the Danubian-Moravian area, and rebelled against Dagobert's successor, was the Merovingian king Sigebert III, even going as far as to declare himself as king, Rex of Thuringii. That's a hell of a rise, considering that here we are seeing essentially already Frankicized context that brings a Thuringian leader to rise, to even claim that Thuringia was now back kind of a kingdom on its own, right? Even given that, of course, he didn't have an actual control over Thuringia. It would be still a lot of Thuringian noblemen who would side with the Franks for obvious reasons. But the fact that there was still this capacity burning under the ashes, right, is quite important. This is a leitmotif. Think about the Stanlinger revolt later on in Carolingian times in Saxony, but this broader realization that the Germany was conquered by the Franks and Frankicized and Christianized and whatever, but was a different political and social reality. Right, the Frankish vassalic beneficiary system couldn't work in a land where resources were less, where there were less cities, less communications. These people were more traditionalist in a sense, and there was these massive forests that effectively even separated peoples from others, that maintained the situation more static in a sense. So it's not before the second half of the 12th century that Germany properly achieves the same levels of feudalization as Western Francia, right? Against Radulf was launched a punitive expedition by the Frankish mayor of Pallas, Grimoald, right? But this expedition failed. Radulf was able to maintain his semi-autonomous position in Thuringia, and his successors of the local ducal dynasty, the Hedenen, supported missionary activity within the duchy, because Thuringia was properly created as a duchy at that point under the Franks, but also eventually lost their hold of Thuringia after the reactivation of Frankish power under the Pippinids in the early 8th century. So, in a way, as other entities in the Frankish Empire proper, this outskirts could rebel, could autonomize, as long as there was no strong royal power in Francia, but when the Pepinids rise with their ever more enhanced and developed, and we can't say at this point professional military system, things are cut short. In fact, a conflict with Charles Martel around 719 brought an end to Thuringian autonomy once again. By the time of Charles Martel and Saint Boniface, at this point there are these important missions in Germany that was barely Christianized at this point. Even in regions that were led formally Christian since centuries, they couldn't even read the Latin of the Bible. I mean, we are at these levels of... they wouldn't even turn heretical because they didn't even have the theological interests or capacities to formulate a controversy. They were just elites that wanted to maintain their control in the situation, more or less as they had always done, this ambiguity in of the frontier. But the Thuringians at that point were again subject to the Franks and ruled by Frankish dukes, with their seat at Würzburg in the south. Under Martel, the Thuringian duke's authority was extended over a part of Austrasia and the Bavarian plateau. So here the eastern frontier is reinforced. As you know, the same Carolingians were the Austrasians, so they knew what the Saxons, the Thuringians, the Alemanni were about. And the valleys of the Lahn, Main, and Neckar rivers were included in their control. Under their control, the Nab formed the southeastern border of Thuringia. At the time, the Werra and Fulda valleys were within it also, and reached as far as the Saxon plain in the north. And in its central, the Thuringian central location in Germany beyond the Rhine was the reason it became the point d'appui of Boniface's mission work. I don't know if you ever visited places full that is beautiful lands, by the way. Thuringia is very fascinating because it really has the taste of ancestrality, right? The beautiful forest, of course the very beautiful later Thuringian history, but it's really a land where you can taste that sense of the hardcore, differently from Saxony. Saxony perhaps is even more so, but Thuringian is more shows more this hybrid, between the north and the south, the roughest and the most developed land. It's powerful. We know that the Thuringians had a separate identity as late as 785, 786, when one of their leading men, Hardrad, led an abortive insurrection against Charlemagne. So again, these guys rebel. These are the same years, by the way, of the Saxon campaigns. So at this point, the Carolingians are pressing hard on the remnants of, with conquest of Saxony, basically they accomplished the unification of Germany with those times boundaries up to the Elbe, right? So there was we've made a video about that, I was saying before, and that was a hell of an accomplishment, but it also equated for these, let's say, the eastern frontier peoples that, the Frankish control would have been even harsher, right? So much, as we were saying before, the Carolingians also codified the Thuringian legal customs, albeit they probably didn't use them extensively, as the Lex Thuringorum, which of course means the Thuringian, the law of the Thuringians, and continued to exact a tribute of pigs, which tells you also, a bit the economical background of these lands. Pigs during the early Middle Ages, with the contraction of agriculture, and so, were very important, and the region still today, a lot of pork specialties and so on. It's a bit typical, but this is a bit of color. This is really fascinating, considering that Gaul was something completely different, but monetization was kind of coming back. We're much more structured and extensive agricultural resources and estates. These guys instead, this was presumably a Merovingian imposition. They, from the province, they pay in pigs. In the 10th century, under the Ottonians, the center of Thuringian power lay in the northeast, near Erfurt, a beautiful city. If you've never been there, please visit it because it's really worth it. And as late as the end of the 10th century, the porcine tribute was still being accepted by the King of Germany, so that basically this thing had become the Thuringian way of payment. Pigs, right? And it's pretty cool. So in 849, the eastern part of Thuringia was eventually organized as the so-called limes Sorabicus, that is the Sorabian boundary, and ordered as the Sorabian mark. Right, the mark is properly the land of frontier, the militarized district in the Carolingian, and eventually, in fact, given the Frankish legacy and feudal system, properly, land of frontier, militarized and specified for defending the border, and placed under, in fact, a duke named Takulf, right? And in the annals of Fulton, his title is literally Dux Sorabici Limitis, which means literally Duke of the Sorabian frontier. But he and his successors were commonly known as Duces Thuringorum, that is, specifically, the Dukes of the Thuringians. So this means, even though Thuringia was objectively small at this point because of all the territorial acquisitions from the side of its neighbors, this literally Sorabian mark that leaves, of course, it's the way a Carolingian would call it. What's that place far there in the eastern frontier? Yes, it's the mark of the, it's the Sorabian frontier is where we go beating those Slavic raiders, right? But the Thuringians thought it otherwise. Of course, they saw it as their home, and therefore the dukedom of Thuringia. It could not be a kingdom anymore at that point, because it was now framed under the broader Eastern Frankish kingdom, and these guys were involved in it, and also they couldn't context it more than much. But they still felt it as their own thing, as their own land, right? Also they set about establishing their power over the Old Dutch, because at the end of the day, there were still the local nobility involved. And after Takulf's death in 873, the Sorbs rose in revolt, because as we were saying before, the Slavs are not tamed, and they are not going to be tamed for a long time. And he was succeeded by his son Radolf. The name recurs. So in 880, King Louis the German replaced Radolf with Poppo, perhaps a kinsman. Poppo instigated a war with Saxony in 882, and in 883 he and his brother Egino fought a civil war for control of Thuringia. So we even have local, properly the same dynasty that fights against each other, in this evidently, synetic reality, right? It's not that these events had wiped out Thuringian potential. No, there was still a margin for local struggle, for competition, rise to power, and the latter in the struggle was victorious. Egino died in 886 when Poppo resumed command, right? So this also reveals how, at the same time, unstable, undefinitive, this powers could be, right? Hell, we're talking about 9th century Germany on the eastern frontier, by the way, so you can't imagine what it was this like. So in 892, also King Arnulf of Carinthia replaced Poppo with Conrad. This is important because it was an act of patronage by the king. For Conrad's house, the Conradines were soon feuding with Poppo's, the Babenbergs. They would be the major Austrian dynasty before the rise of the Habsburgs. But Conrad's rule was, however, short, perhaps because he had lack of local support. So at this point, he was replaced by Burkhard, whose title in 903 was Marchio Thuringianum, that is, Margrave of the Thuringians. So this is a mix of the thing before. It's a mix between the mark and the local ethnic recognition, which actually, just as a titling, speaks for what the Eastern Frankish situation was at the time. That is, this local so-called ethnic duchies were establishing now as proper, given that the imperial power altogether was not that much, but they were acquiring their own prerogatives, maintaining properly their territorial assets, and participating as from the participation of local elites to imperial policy. Burkhard had to defend Thuringia from the incursions of the Magyars at this point that were ravaging Germany, and in fact he was himself defeated and killed in battle against the Hungars, along with the former Duke Egino on August the 3rd, 908. Right? And he was actually the last recorded Duke of Thuringia. This is an interesting time because actually between the end of the 9th and the beginning of the 10th century, as you know, that imperial power was de facto non-existent. I mean, aside from some duke or margrave in Italy that was just next door to Rome and could buy, could seize the imperial crown. I mean, before the rise of the Ottonians, there was no true power. I mean, the Carolingian Empire had dissolved, and just first Henry the Fowler in Germany, and then eventually Otto the First in Germany and Italy would revive the thing, and so that's why it's ideally there that the so-called Holy Roman Empire begins, even though it's the same empire of Charlemagne, and literally it wasn't even called Holy Roman Empire. So there is actually it doesn't make any sense to think that the Ottonians founded or refounded the Holy Roman Empire. This is just a myth. But they surely accomplished a big deal anyway. But the duchy, the Thuringian duchy, was the smallest at this point of these so-called younger stem duchies, right? And was absorbed by Saxony after Burkhard's death, right? And there also the rise of the Ottonians in part, or at least, the rise of Saxony as an important center of power that eventually would couple itself with Franconia, that was in the most Frankicized land of the empire, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, as the same name reveals, and that would put the kind of its military power at the service of this more economically developed land of Franconia, and Thuringia would pay the expenses of it. At a point, Burkhard's sons were finally expelled, in fact, by Duke Henry the Fowler himself in 913. There's probably still a bit of antagonism in here, because Saxony, in spite of the resilience that it showed against the Carolingian conquest, became one of the most successfully Frankicized lands. The one from which the same Renovation Empire started. I mean, just imagine if they had told Charlemagne that their empire would have fallen and that basically the Saxons would have revived it. Well, that's hell. You would have not guessed it. So, in this sense, given, as we've seen just right now, that the Saxons were more connected with Franconia, we can think that the Thuringians ideally were still that resistant thing that didn't still hope to maintain its own autonomy in spite of all these waves of power from the west, right? Even though now they were still fully framed in the system of the kingdom and the empire altogether eventually. So we can conclude by saying that Thuringians remained a distinct people. In the Middle Ages, their land was famously organized as a landgraviate. We will talk about that maybe in another video, but I thought it was interesting to talk about it, because it's one of those realities that, yes, they were kind of secondary in the bigger international game, but at the same time they contributed importantly to it. I mean, if it hadn't been for Basina, we would have had Clovis, guys, and their role as a center of balance at certain levels in Germany, in Eastern Francia, and the important presence of Thuringia in European culture and history, it's worth being remembered, because it's really what we're made of, right, as Europeans, is this very often not the big national thing, but the local reality that made eventually also the national one, and that, however, must be understood in this regard in its origin, right? And I hope we will keep covering such entities, or maybe even talking about still the bigger ones, but gradually deepening into this others. And so that's pretty much it. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.